The American Atheists organization, which is widely accepted by atheists as representative of their movement, defines atheism thus, quote, "Atheism is one thing, a lack of belief in gods," unquote. In this essay, I will show that this newly invented definition is deliberately deceitful and incoherent, and that it is used as a shield against legitimate criticism of atheism, which holds the view that there is no such thing as God or gods. Furthermore, American Atheists is, in fact, a leftist activist group founded by a radical feminist who used the same tricks invented by intersectional feminists to isolate their enemy by mangling the definition of atheism and then recruiting other identities into their new big tent. But they contradict themselves to such a degree on their website that they have reduced atheism to an incoherent mess, which I will call Neo-Atheism, in order to distinguish it from the former intellectually coherent atheist position. Unfortunately, the fraudulent position of American atheists on atheism has inspired a smug and arrogant sense of superiority in their supplicants, who now act as if they have landed the knockout punch in debates, when in fact they are merely hiding behind the smokescreen of their illegitimate definition. These people have been duped to such a degree that I suggest they have been intellectually abused. This smug attitude immediately showed its ugly face in the comments of my first video in this series, Atheism is Untenable. Here is a small sampling of those comments. "You are simply a religious idiot full of idiotic theses and arguments. You have the scientific literacy of a toddler. Nice job, incel. This was so spectacularly stupid it made me itch everywhere. All I hear is narcissistic babbling from some weirdos who booster their deformed egos." I also received non-juvenile, but no less smug, responses in private, like the following, quote, "I really wish you had emailed me your script of this before making a video. I think you might want to take down that current video. I do hope that you speak to me about atheism in the future before doing a video on it. I mean, that's something I understand about after all. If you put up a retraction/correction video and or want help making it or whatever, I'm happy to help you with that," unquote. And though this person may have been well-intentioned, his comments illustrate the absolute sense of certainty and superiority that neo-atheists hold. They believe that they have found the answers and are therefore the authorities to be consulted, not just someone with an argument to be contested. Well, this is my response, and I offer it without having consulted any self-proclaimed authority. The neo-atheist claim that my definition of atheism is a straw man is the only objection worth addressing, and here is the exact definition that I quoted from Encyclopedia Britannica. Quote, "Generally, atheism is a denial of God or of the gods. And if religion is defined in terms of belief in spiritual beings, then atheism is the rejection of all religious belief," unquote. And further, atheism, quote, "casts a wider net than the claims made by specific religions like Christianity, and rejects all belief in spiritual beings." One fellow made a lengthy video in which he suggested that if I had only read various discussions on other encyclopedia websites, I would know that I had completely misrepresented atheism. But I did read those discussions, and I found that the belief that God or gods do not exist is the central, consistent, most well-known and accepted definition of atheism in every encyclopedia. Here is the very first sentence from the Oxford Encyclopedia on Atheism. Quote, "The term atheist describes a person who does not believe that God or a divine being exists." Here are a couple of more quotes from the Oxford site. Quote, "It has come to be widely accepted that to be an atheist is to deny that a god or gods exist," unquote. And further on, atheists typically take the view that there is sufficient evidence to justify concluding that there is no God, unquote. I addressed the error of this last atheist position about evidence in my first video and may expand on that in a later essay since it is an important and complex topic. However, my neo-atheist antagonist even specifically stated that the Stanford Encyclopedia proved that the definition I used was a straw man. So here is the statement that the Stanford site used to sum up their position on the definition of atheism as it pertains to my thesis. Quote, "In philosophy, however, and more specifically in the philosophy of religion, the term atheism is standardly used to refer to the proposition that God does not exist, or more broadly, to the proposition that there are no gods." Unquote. Clearly, my first video falls into the category of a philosophical argument about religion, and clearly the definition I used was the single most appropriate definition of atheism available. To choose otherwise would have turned my video into an endless description of the subtle ways in which atheists try to wiggle out of that central characteristic of atheism. But my antagonist chose not to mention that critical piece of information from the Stanford site to his viewers. Why? Because it destroys his thesis that I used a straw man. Let's spend a moment looking at history before I get to the hot mess that is American atheists and their monstrous invention, neo-atheism. In the early part of the Enlightenment, it was still dangerous to declare disbelief in the existence of God, and many people were killed for just such an act. However, in the 18th century, a philosophical essay by a French Catholic priest, Jean Meslier, titled Thoughts and Feelings of Jean Meslier, was published posthumously. In his essay, quote, Meslier rejects the concept of God, the soul, miracles, and the discipline of theology, unquote. And according to philosopher Michel Onfray, this essay marks the beginning of the history of true atheism. Another quote taken from the same Wikipedia page shows that the belief that God or gods do not exist was indeed considered to be the definition of atheism at that time, as it is up to this day. Quote, "The first open denial of the existence of God and avowal of atheism since classical times may be that of Baron Dolge-Bach in his 1770 work, The System of Nature," unquote. I'm well aware that some philosophers held more nuanced views about God, but they were careful not to identify as atheists. But this hasn't stopped neo-atheists from trying to prop up their credibility by projecting their own beliefs onto those philosophers, an act of historical revisionism not unlike what we've seen from feminists. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, is listed as an atheist even though he criticized atheism as much as he did the church. These quotes from the essay Friedrich Nietzsche's Atheism on study.com explains it nicely. Quote, Friedrich Nietzsche is arguably the world's most famous atheist. Ironically, Nietzsche despised this term and what it meant, unquote. And further on, quote, to him, common atheists share the same fallacies as Christians. They both follow rules, they both put their faith in something. Christians put their faith in their religion, atheists put their faith in the non-existence of God. Either way, they both impose rules of what should and shouldn't be believed. Since Nietzsche espoused existentialism, the idea that men are free from artificially imposed rules, he thought both the atheists and the Christians were fools. Nietzsche would not call himself an atheist specifically because atheism was understood to be, quote, faith in the non-existence of God, unquote, which is still true today and in its slightly modernized version, quote, belief in the non-existence of God, unquote. I offer the modernized version because I was asked by a neo-atheist to define faith in this same context. One reason that neo-atheists want to characterize Nietzsche as an atheist against his wishes is that he was famously critical of the Christian God. It's an example of the ancient proverb, quote, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," unquote. And neo-atheists see Christianity as enemy number one. But Nietzsche's personal belief that gods don't exist disqualifies him as an atheist under the American Atheists' new definition, as we shall see shortly. Karl Marx is a notable unabashed atheist from the 19th century who of course subscribed to the definition that gods do not exist, and was quite clear in his hatred of religion. Interestingly, Marxism heavily influenced the future growth of radical feminism, and it was a radical feminist who would later use the deceitful techniques of intersectional feminism to transform atheism into the incoherent mess of neo-atheism. Let's have a closer look at the American Atheists website, which begins with their most important assertions. Quote, "Atheism is one thing, a lack of belief in gods," unquote. And secondly, quote, "Atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God," unquote. This is the definition that every neo-atheist insists upon and repeats ad nauseum, including in the comments to my first video. Clearly, this definition excludes anyone who believes that God or gods do not exist because, in this new definition, that is precisely what atheism is not, unquote. We can immediately see that legitimate atheists have no home in neo-atheism. Where can the legitimate atheist hang his hat when the neo-atheist definition explicitly excludes him and even denounces him as not being an atheist? In other words, neither Friedrich Nietzsche nor Karl Marx fit this definition, and yet neo-atheists embraced the hatred of the church that these two embodied, as is evident on the American Atheists website. Furthermore, we already had a category called non-believer, more recently shortened to none, and a category called existentialist, both of which are a better fit for those who claim a lack of belief in God than is atheism. So we are left to wonder what motivated neo-atheists to completely muddy the water and make the legit atheists invisible with smoke and mirrors. They must see some advantage in usurping the word atheism. Changing the definition of atheism was necessary in order to justify railroading others into their growing tent, and they waste no time about it, as we can see from their website. Quote, "Some groups will use words like agnostic, humanist, secular, bright, free thinker, or any number of other terms to self-identify. Those words are perfectly fine as a self-identifier, but we strongly advocate using the word that people understand, atheist," unquote. This is insulting. People do understand agnostic, humanist, secular, existentialist, etc. perfectly well. They also understand that atheist means the belief that gods do not exist, which is why they chose not to call themselves atheists. Let's continue with more from the website. Quote, "Don't use those other terms to disguise your atheism or to shy away from a word that some think has a negative connotation. We should be using the terminology that is most accurate and that answers the question that is actually being asked. We should use the term that binds us all together," unquote. The deceit here is monumental in the presumptuous use of the phrase, quote, "your atheism," unquote, as if the reader is too stupid to decide for herself. Furthermore, the term atheist, as bastardized by the neo-atheists, is less accurate than humanist or any of the other terms mentioned above, because neo-atheists have deliberately made atheism vague. Notice, too, the appeal to togetherness, so reminiscent of the intersectional feminists who urge their followers to band together against the common enemy, patriarchy. And there's more. Quote, "If you call yourself a humanist, a free thinker, a bright, or even a cultural Catholic, and lack belief in a God, you are an atheist." No, they are not. We must assume that people have thought it through for themselves and have decided that another term, like humanist, describes them more accurately than does the term atheist. This trick is copied directly from the feminists, as this quote from Emma Watson makes clear. Quote, "If you stand for equality, then you're a feminist," unquote. Watson's deceitful claim has been repeated, paraphrased, and widely accepted throughout the West, despite the fact that feminism is, in fact, the antithesis of equality. Neo-atheists hope to achieve the same level of success at deceiving the public about atheism, with or without your approval, as the next quote demonstrates. Only about 5% of people call themselves atheists. But if you ask about belief in gods, 11% say they do not believe in gods. Those people are atheists, whether they choose to use the word or not, unquote. The dishonesty here, too, is striking. These neo-atheists know nothing about the beliefs of those 11%, but they are counting them as atheists. Notice, too, that they are willing to include as atheists those 11% who do not believe in gods, despite the fact that their definition explicitly excludes those who do not believe in gods. Remember their insistence that, quote, "atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God," unquote. In true neo-atheist form, it is when it's useful, but it isn't when challenged. Does that remind you of anything? Remember The Fraud of Feminism by E. Belfort Bax? Taken together, these claims by American atheists serve one purpose: to isolate their enemy by exclusion, which is exactly what intersectional feminists do when they include every possible identity under their now planet-sized tent, except the straight white male, who has been selected for ridicule and vilification by exclusion. In their turn, American atheists have singled out the Christian idea of a personal God who can be petitioned through prayer and who not only created the world but actively sustains it for special ridicule. It is Christianity in particular that they hate. The neo-atheists are afraid of traditional Christians, and not without historical reason, but that does not excuse their fraudulent, distorted philosophy. By trying to absorb everyone but traditional Christians, neo-atheists seek to imply to the world that these Christians stand alone on the outside of reason and rational discourse. Clearly, this is intellectually dishonest, and worse, it is a form of bullying. We shouldn't be surprised at the similarities between neo-atheists and intersectional feminists, because the founder of American Atheists, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, was herself a radical feminist, though she used the equivalent term militant feminist that was common in the 1960s. And she was an obnoxious feminist, according to Phil Donahue. Quote, "Donahue said that O'Hair was unpleasant in person and had mocked him off camera for being a Catholic." Here we see the special hatred reserved for Christianity. And the following anecdote gives us a sense of the animus that drove O'Hair. Quote, "In 1980, she publicly rejected her estranged son Bill when he announced that he had converted to Christianity," unquote. This was certainly painful for her son, who wrote in his own memoir, quote, One could call this a postnatal abortion on the part of a mother, I guess." Unquote. And he offered the following as an explanation for his mother's act, which, as far as I can tell, are not her words, but words he imagines that she might have said. Quote, "I repudiate him entirely and completely for now and all times. He is beyond human forgiveness." Unquote. This purported disownment comes from the woman whose website declares, without irony, that an atheist is someone who, quote, "wants man to understand and love man." Apparently that love is not to be extended towards a man who leaves the cult of Neo-Atheism, not even if he is your own son. It's difficult to imagine such hardness of heart towards one's own son over the act of his conversion to Christianity, but it does expose the depth of her animus and therefore her desire to distort and weaponize atheism in the same manner that as a radical feminist she learned to isolate her enemy and weaponize the idea of equality. You would be hard-pressed to find a stronger animus against Christianity, and this animus motivated her to become one of the most influential promoters of neo-atheism. A critic might claim that I am exaggerating her influence upon atheism, but I will point out that American Atheists reflects the core beliefs and attitudes of the majority of self-described atheists that I now encounter, including those who ridiculed but could not argue against my video, "Atheism is Untenable." Furthermore, this mangled definition has spread like a cancer throughout the nation of atheism, even to the point of exterminating the legitimate species. The American Atheists website goes to great lengths to rationalize the following claim, quote, "Atheism is not a belief system, nor is it a religion." And their very next statement reads, "While there are some religions that are atheistic, certain sects of Buddhism, for example, that does not mean that atheism is a religion." Unquote. This statement is emblematic of the incoherent nature of American atheists. It claims that atheism is not a religion or a belief system, but in the same sentence, Buddhism gets drawn into the atheism tent while being accepted as both a religion and a belief system. In other words, this atheism has no definition at all, so it can include the religion and belief system of Buddhism and still not be itself a belief system. It's hard to imagine a more deliberately vague and meaningless definition of any word, much less one that already had a clear and specific meaning. One could literally include anything under the neo-atheism umbrella. The site then goes on to detail what they do believe, making clear that neo-atheism is, at the very least, a system of belief. And after suffering through this quagmire of deceit, here are some of their explicit beliefs. Atheism is predicated on ancient Greek materialism. Atheism involves the mental attitude that unreservedly accepts the supremacy of reason. Atheism declares that the cosmos is devoid of immanent conscious purpose. Atheism insists there is no supernatural interference in human life. Atheism insists human beings are capable of creating a social system based on reason and justice. All of these are quotes from the American Atheists website. That's a lot of beliefs for a group that is, quote, not a belief system, and whose identity is limited to, quote, a lack of belief in gods. But wait, isn't the statement that atheism, quote, declares that the cosmos is devoid of immanent conscious purpose, quote, unquote, just another way of saying positively that there is no God? Oh well, never mind that. The American Atheist site and the mind of the neo-atheist is so filled with such dissonance that there is no hope of sorting through it all. Let's plod just a little further into the world of this registered public charity that holds no beliefs, don't read the fine print, has hundreds of chapters, holds conferences, organizes activist groups, and seeks donations from a committed congregation, and is not a religion, of course. The issues for which American atheists advocate fall in line with those of Marxist feminists. For example, they rally for abortion rights and deny that any doctor has a right to refuse to perform certain procedures, like sex change operations, for instance, due to conscientious objection on religious grounds. The American atheists' stance on abortion alone shows the hypocrisy of their claim that, quote, religious beliefs should not be used as the primary justification for any policy, unquote. Clearly, one must have an implicit belief that the fetus is not a human being in order to justify the right of a woman to terminate its life. This is an act of faith on the same order as the belief that the fetus is a human being who must be protected. Here, neo-atheists are really just petitioning the government to use neo-atheist faith instead of Christian faith as the primary justification for abortion policy. Is it an accident that the American atheists' activism lines up so nicely with the leftist agenda? I don't think so. I have looked into the background of some of the board members and employees, and in each instance I found that the organization and its members are Democrat and that they despise Republicans. The president of American Atheists, Nick Fish, regularly tweets his hatred of Trump and the Republican Party, and he is obsessed with the issue of white Christian nationalism, to the point of suggesting that Trump is its leader. White Christian nationalism. Maybe that's where the patriarchy is hiding. Apart from being obvious crazy talk, it's worth noting that at no point does he offer any criticism of BLM, Antifa, or black nationalist movements, exactly as one might expect from a Marxist leftist. And when he does mention Islam in the US, it is with a sympathetic tone, in clear contrast to his open hostility towards Christianity, also exactly as we've seen from feminists. The tone of the American Atheists website and the public messaging of the group's principles makes clear that Christianity is to neo-atheism what patriarchy is to feminism, a boogeyman that is used to justify the hatred in their hearts. The majority of those who call themselves atheists under the planet-sized umbrella of neo-atheism have been duped. And I can't blame them, because the sleight of hand is clever enough and very few people have the time or inclination to root out this deceit, which has spread like a cancer in the atheist community. Many were easy targets for seduction because of their pre-existing anger at neo-atheism's prime enemy, Christianity. Having had bad experiences in Christian organizations, they would have been keen to join an all-inclusive team whose existence isolates their previous tormentor. But those who have an inclination toward intellectual integrity should disavow neo-atheism and find their way to a group that accurately reflects their views on God, religion, spirituality, faith, or meaning. Because neo-atheism is just as corrupt as the intersectional feminism that inspired its decline into arrogant, self-satisfied, incoherent madness. In his book, The Fraud of Feminism, E. Belfort Bax wrote that feminists, like a chimera, embody two incompatible feminisms, which I loosely describe here. Political feminism, which demands change consistent with their belief that they are oppressed, and sentimental feminism, which hides from challenge behind their traditional privileges. And Bax details how feminists flip-flop between these two extremes, adding to their accustomed privileges while avoiding any accompanying responsibilities. Feminists argue that a woman can do anything a man can do, while maintaining that she deserves special treatment because she is weaker than a man. We can see the same fraud in neo-atheism by applying Bax's idea. The following two atheisms coexist within neo-atheism: political atheism, which demands change consistent with their beliefs, and sentimental atheism, which hides from challenge behind their claim that they merely lack belief in gods. Did the neo-atheists learn this trick from feminists as well? Maybe. More importantly, I have demonstrated that neo-atheists have deliberately made an incoherent mess of the simple idea of atheism. And though atheism may be untenable, neo-atheism is far worse. It is fraudulent. My characterization of American atheists as the inventor of neo-atheism is clearly a rhetorical device designed to focus attention on the topic by creating a clear antagonist. My argument about neo-atheism is not weakened in any manner by the fact that this definition may have arisen simultaneously in many quarters of the atheist community. American Atheists remains representative of the present fraudulent state of neo-atheism, as attested to by the fact that, to my knowledge, there exist no atheist groups with the backbone to defend the legitimate traditional atheist position that gods do not exist. They have all hooked their hopes upon the rising star of neo-atheism. Unfortunately, this is a shooting star that briefly outshines all others, but whose substance disappears in a flash upon a moment's scrutiny. Furthermore, though neo-atheists deny that they have made a god of science, their choice of logos betrays them. They have even stolen the most recognizable symbol of science and used it to symbolize their movement in a bald attempt to benefit from the high status of science in Western culture through association. If you truly believe that your views on God are accurately described as non-belief, then be honest and call yourself a nun, or maybe an existentialist like Nietzsche, because you are not an atheist. I have a lot to say in future videos about non-belief, or more specifically, non-thought, which I believe is a very important state accessible through meditation and from which we can all gain tremendous insight.